All right. So Norman Mailer, born 1923, um, graduated from Harvard, attempted to get a draft deferment, but failed and was drafted into the Army in 1944. And he served in the Pacific for several months in 1945, and then briefly in the Army of Occupation in Japan after the end of the war. As out of these wartime experiences, he ended up writing a novel called The Naked and the Dead, that it remains sort of perennially on lists of important novels of American novels from the 20th century. So rooted very closely in his wartime experiences. He spends the rest of his life as a writer. The Armies of the Night, published in 1968, is an account of the march on the Pentagon in October of 1967. Mailer is there. He's one of the kind of intellectual participants in the march. He's arrested briefly for his participation, and writes this book as a result. The book wins the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction and the National Book Award. And it's interesting in a number of ways, in part because Mailer is using it as a vehicle for what we might call now creative nonfiction, or what's sometimes called the nonfiction novel, that feels maybe like a bit of a paradox, but it's, well, I think maybe Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. This is the sort of literary vein that Mailer is working in. And what he's trying to capture is what's happened on this day in October at this massive protest on the steps of the Pentagon. And so I want to look at a couple of different moments in the handouts here. And I'd actually like to start in the middle, if we could, on page 254. And I'd like to look just from 254 to like the bottom of 255, just this, or just it's one kind of long-ish paragraph where he describes what journalism or history can do and what the novel can do, what fiction might do. And then he's trying to think about what these two different modes of writing might offer someone interested in covering this event.
I think he's admitting that even though he was there, he couldn't see everything. He's not going to be able to do a true, full, factual account. So he recognizes that there is to be a novelistic aspect to the way he's writing in this.
The limits of eyewitness, what are the limits, and the advantages? What are the limits of history, factual reporting, right? And then where does, you said novelistic was the word you used. What does that mean, and where does it how does it come to bear on our understanding of events? Let's keep the conversation going. We're
to piggyback off her point. It was more like you can be there and see what's happening, but the Pentagon is going to spin it into their own like messaging.
Sure.
So you're never going to get like the true accounting, unless you're like inside the Pentagon working, probably.
Right. He has this whole fascinating moment in at another section in this. I think I excerpted it too, where he's talking about the numbers of people involved and about how you could figure out how many were actually there by reading the Conservative and the Underground papers. And like, he has a complex mathematical formula for how they either deflate or inflate the numbers based on their particular perspective. So there is something about the truth that, whatever that might be, is missing in the official accounts even, and that Mailer wants to get at that. Okay. What is novelistic? There's a fabulous way to start thinking about this. Is this thing a novel? He writes about himself. This will tell you everything you need to know about Norman Mailer. Throughout, he refers to himself as Mailer in the third person, and he's written as a self-insert character in this for the entire novel or book, text, whatever, however we want to label it. So you can imagine Norman Mailer at his typewriter saying, "Mailer walked over here," and it's wild and weird and fabulous. But what's a novel, and what's its role? What's the role of the novel have to do with writing about the March on the Pentagon?
Well, history, like, there's always like a tension between like history and like literature. I think history is more like macro, or a big picture. Whereas like, I feel literature is more micro, and you need a novel to like reflect like the diverse like experiences that people go through. Whereas history, maybe like in the case of like the Vietnam War, you would just say like the terrible thing, how many deaths, how many casualties, how many and how many deaths, how many survived. Whereas if you read like a novel like the Blackstone, I Dream of Peace, it feels very like there's people who find actually like they don't really care about the war as much, and they're actually just living their life like very ordinarily, and they care about like love and like that. So it gives like a more like wider perspective instead of historians always focus on maybe like various metrics or various things that they're looking at. So novel, I think, serves as a function of kind of give like a more diverse range of like recollection of what really happened.
I like that. This is a fascinating, and Toy's account is it's like autobiography. It's a diary. It's a memoir. It's her own writing. It has a kind of truth. But I love where you're thinking about this and how you're thinking about history is concerned with the number of people and what time did they reach this section of the wall and who went inside and these kinds of things. It doesn't seem the love of M doesn't really fit in. It's historical, but it doesn't seem to fit in proper historical accounts. Right? But the novel, a work of fiction, as we usually think of a novel, can make time for those individual feelings. Maybe
It turns something linear, history, into something that can be intimate, that can be emotional, that can play on your feelings. And that's very powerful for the reader. Seeing the methods of history versus the instincts of the novelist, and that the novel, yes, the historian can use all those journalistic methods, but as was pointed out before, they're incoherent and Miller says inaccurate, contradictory, and so on. So there's a point where the emotional and spiritual and psychical has to come in, he says, and that's where the novel comes in.
Right. And then it seems that Mailer is reminding us that the emotional, the spiritual, right, matter tremendously, as they are, as those experiences are as important to Mailer as the historical record.
Because the historian he doesn't say this in these words, but to me, the historian is a human being with all of those aspects. So, and then have journalistic, the historian tries to be, that person is still bringing emotion.
Okay. So there's a need here for imaginative literature in Mailer's account, or at least the techniques of imaginative literature to tell this story, because he's still narrating, he's still describing something that's actually happened. All of the people in this are real people. This isn't a complete work of fiction, but he's using literary techniques to try to get this across in a way that he thinks is going to be effective to his reader. All right, cool. Let's scoot back towards the beginning a little bit, and I want to look at the moment that the protesters breached the Pentagon, and I want to start with the very last line on page 251, the second significant event that begins there, and I want to just read to what did I mark? 253 or so. So Mailer's not in the Pentagon at this moment, right? He's about to be shortly arrested, probably but outside of the Pentagon. And I'm sorry if I totally failed to offer a little more context before I threw you back into Mailer on this. Of the 100,000 plus demonstrators who began a long protest, please come through, on the National Mall on October 21st, 1967. Tens of thousands, maybe about 35,000, marched from the mall to the Pentagon. And this was completely planned. There's much made about the negotiations between the protesters and the government to select a route, times, so that there was an appropriate control and everything was supposed to go a certain way. But a number of protesters are eager. and a few, as we see in this passage, actually breached the outer barriers and then found a way into the Pentagon. And I want to think a little bit about Mailer's language. This is all in 252. They made a quick push, broke the line, broke through the MPs, and actually entered the Holy of Holies. They were in the Pentagon, racing down a corridor. Not for long. Right. The new mobilization committee to end the war in Vietnam is responsible for orchestrating the entire protest. And by that, I mean the whole event from the mall to the Pentagon. And they're the ones who are working with the government to have a legal protest that's permitted. They have Dr. Spock, all of their speakers lined up. It's going to be, sort of standard 1960s national protest formula. Within that, there are lots of other groups that are working alongside the new mobilization committee that are eager to join. One being the Students for Democratic Society, and the other is a group of other loosely affiliated groups that's generally called the Revolutionary Contingent. Now, the SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, are one of the original sort of 60s radical groups. They're actually a little bit late to take a prominent role in anti-war protests, in part because SDS's radicalism is much broader than just the war. And their concern among SDS leadership, particularly in the early years of the Vietnam War, is that if they become too closely involved with national anti-war politics, they're going to get lumped in as just another anti-war group. SDS is more interested in grassroots organization and revolutionary change at a local level that they hope will then filter upward into national change. So they're a little bit uneasy about the protests to begin with. When the new mobilization committee suggests that there are opportunities for kind of direct confrontation, it sort of whets the appetite, and they make they change the plan. So as everyone's marching across the Memorial Bridge to get to the Pentagon from the mall, a group of 100 or so SDS and Revolutionary Contingent protesters sprint on another route through the woods to get there first to a different area of the Pentagon where they're not supposed to be, and that's where they breach. And then Mailer will ask later, were they successful because they were early, because they were surprised, or because who knows? But they get in. And they're almost immediately arrested. And that's the passage that you pointed out that I want to read, because this is this not for long bit. I want to ask about Mailer's tone here in this passage, and what it might tell us, what he's telling us. So on 252, still, not for long. Troops had been brought into the Pentagon the night before. They'd slept on cots in the corridors of the building, which is not unlike laying out one's mattress in Lincoln Tunnel, right? So probably not regular. Confined inside, suffering the tension of endless hours, waiting for unseen anarchists, bomb throwers, communists, poison gassers, poison in the water, nymphomaniacs, drug addicts, insane Negroes, and common city folk to inundate them under their human wave in these drear corridors, one can only guess, unless there are films, at the unmitigated fury with which the few demonstrators were clubbed and kicked, arrested, and carried off. Were they sitting around there quivering, waiting for this long? Look, what is this list?
He's making fun.
Yes, he is. Of who was he making fun of?
It's the guys who were coming in.
Oh, good. Great. So this it's a caricature of what?
Of the invaders.
Okay, right, exactly. Because is that an accurate description of? I mean, it was the SDS, right? Right. So they're the real gung-ho protesters. But still, is this an accurate description? Are they nymphomaniacs charging into the Pentagon? Mailer could have it both ways, right? There's something ridiculous in perhaps the composition of the protest crowd, in as much as there is something ridiculous in this suggestion of the, I don't know, fantastical left-wing mob of human flesh that's marauding. Third of the way down on 253, right? He writes, one does not even know the guns are unloaded. These are amateur soldiers, so innocent of war they do not know enough to deduce. So these amateur soldiers are the protesters, right? That if there are no magazines loaded into the rifles, there can be at most but one round in the chamber, right? It was not so easy, therefore, when the moment came to charge into the Pentagon. So on the one hand, again, this is Mailer's perspective. Like these protesters, they don't even know that they don't really have to be afraid of the rifles that the soldiers are carrying because they're just basically clubs. They're unloaded. But he also recognizes that most of the protesters don't know that. And they charge at the soldiers with their own misconceptions of what might happen. And, rightly or wrongly, an act of courage in Mailer's assessment of it. I want to look at one more passage quickly, if we could, back to 255 and pick up where we left off, and just read on to 257, I think. And I want to think a little bit about. Actually, let's just do 257, if you would, please. I'm sorry. Last paragraph on 257, the one that begins, if the troops were relieved. I want to look at this for a little bit and try to think a bit about, and this is again me thinking of Tway's diary and socialism and Mailer's sense of how class fits into the response and to the protests here. So we'll start 257, if you would. So what are you mentioned the class differences. What's the sort of loose class alignment that Mailer sees here in this confrontation between the soldiers and the protesters? Who are the protesters?
Yeah, they're the urban, the middle class.
Urban middle class, and what are they like?
They're intimidated by the brute strength of the working class.
Oh, okay, right. And who are the working class in this confrontation?
Those are the defenders of Pentagon.
Right. So the soldiers that are out there confronting them, right? And so for a moment, Mailer sits back and takes a look at this moment of some Americans confronting other Americans in this scene and tries to understand it as a kind of class warfare. But he says, look, you would need to bring back Marx to make any sense of this. Why? Why can't, what's where's the conundrum? What does he find strange?
They did not have to work with their hands and work the lambs, and they had opportunities, and through the opportunity of getting educated, they were able to leave behind quote unquote manual labor and.
Right. This is there's the incongruity, right? That seems that's what's because they had so much.
Marx flipped because Marx was really encouraging the lower class to revolt against the upper class who had so much, and now it's vice versa.
And now the lower class, the working class, are the soldiers here defending the Pentagon, defending the idea of what Mailer writes as early on as an imperialist war in the last capitalist nation, right? So Mailer sees a tremendous irony in the class antagonism visibly on display between the protesters and the soldiers, and the class antagonism called for by Marx in the sort of revolutionary ideology, in which case these working class soldiers ought to be protesting the machine that's sending working class people off to these imperial wars. But it's not. It's got working class people defending this. And this is Mailer wryly poking fun at both protesters and the U.S. government, but he seems to have found an inconsistency, right? One of many, and this is part of Mailer's a keen eye for these discontinuities or these inconsistencies in things. No matter what the SDS might want to work to achieve within its own set of revolutionary reforms for the United States, this ain't it. I think as far as what Mailer would acknowledge is that the working class is probably harmed more by the war than the middle class is. Why aren't you fighting the imperialists? It's right. Well, because they have other loyalties to friends or community in that kind of sense too.